Good evening, everyone. I am Roz Engel, President of the World Affairs Council of New Jersey. We're an educational nonprofit dedicated to civic engagement and public programs on global affairs. We're a new and growing organization committed to bringing independent, timely, and thought-provoking programs on world events and U.S. foreign policy to New Jersey. Our website has lots more information and provides some opportunities to donate or join as a member, so please check our pages out. Tonight, we are really lucky to have Alan Pino with us, one of the country's top experts on the Middle East. Last spring, Alan retired after a very distinguished 35-year career at the CIA. He spent the last 15 years of that career as the National Intelligence Officer for the Middle East. As the NIO, Alan was the Senior Analytic Officer in the U.S. intelligence community on Middle East issues, covering North Africa, the Eastern Med, the Gulf, and the Levant. He led a senior analytic team that directly supported the President and the National Security Council, and he supervised the drafting of mid to long-range intelligence estimates, including many national intelligence estimates. Many, many thanks, Alan, for taking the time to be with us tonight. So in terms of our timeline tonight, I'm going to start with about 30 to 40 minutes of Q&A. And then we'll go to some audience questions after that, and our program will end right around 9:15. Okay, so I'm just checking. Looks like people are in. All right, Alan, so why don't we get going?
Okay, great.
I think it makes sense to start kind of with a little bit of history. The Arab Spring started just about a decade ago with an act of personal and political defiance in Tunisia, and it quickly cascaded across the region. And you were the NIO for the Middle East during this period, which I do not envy you. I was wondering if you could take us back to that time a bit and describe what you think happened and why. And then maybe we could talk a little bit when you finish with that, with what it was like to cover those events from inside the government. What were some of the questions that policymakers were asking, some of the problems and issues that the intelligence community was facing?
Great, Roz, thanks. It's good to be here tonight and to have a chance to talk to you, talk to everyone who's on the video about the Middle East, about the Arab Spring and its impact in the region. So I'll start with reviewing in a broad way what the Arab Spring was and how it played out, what some of the key factors were that influenced the way things were way things developed, and then talk a little bit, as you asked, about both my immediate experience as an NIO during that time, but also lessons we learned as an intelligence community. So first of all, the Arab Spring, I think, was a kind of a unifying region-wide event in that there was a similar impulse and set of concerns, I think, that motivated people across the region. But the uprisings did play out in different ways in different countries. And in fact, some countries escaped altogether, at least initially, from the impact of the uprisings. So I thought it'd be useful to review briefly where the uprisings or protests took place and then look at some of the factors that were involved. You mentioned Tunisia, and of course Egypt followed, but protests were already taking place even before Egypt, before protests erupted in Egypt. They were taking place in other countries across the region. So the impulse was widely felt that Tunisia had unleashed. By mid-February of 2011, we had seen two leaders depart, both Ben Ali in Tunisia and Mubarak had stepped down in Egypt. You also had protests and violence going on in Libya, Morocco, a little bit in Algeria, Jordan, Bahrain, Yemen, Oman, and by March in Syria and Saudi Arabia. The success that the Tunisian protesters had in forcing the Ben Ali to flee appears to have had an impact in convincing Egyptian young people and activists that they could rise up. And then when they did, while there were already protests going on in the region, the Egyptian uprising really resonated very powerfully because of Egypt's position as kind of the Arab leader, the largest Arab state, and kind of a cultural and political leader for decades in the Arab world. So people were very inspired by what was happening in Egypt. There were a number of common factors across the region that influenced the protests. The chant that was heard everywhere was bread, justice, and dignity, which I think captures the kind of the essence of what people were thinking about and felt pretty simply. First of all, economic conditions were key. The impact of neoliberal economic reforms over the preceding decade had a really negative impact on many middle class and lower class people in the Arab world. You had seen governments trying to shed state-owned industries, also cut subsidies that they had long sustained. You had seen the currencies being kind of liberalized, and you had seen government services cut back in many of these countries across the region. And the result was that many people who had depended on the subsidies and many people who had depended on government employment lost jobs and suddenly found their cost of living going up. Meanwhile, the elites in countries like Egypt were benefiting from the economic investment that was flowing in from abroad for large contracts that the Egyptian government was sort of managing. And in Tunisia and Egypt and other places, those contracts went to a favored few. I think people saw that and were made, and certainly were angry about that. So that added to a sense of, I think, frustration that had already existed as these conditions worsened over the decade leading up to 2011. Lack of political participation was a factor, but also a sense that regime elites, I think, held citizens in contempt. And you saw this, I think, very powerfully in Egypt, where Mubarak had been promoting his son Gamal as his successor for the previous decade. And by the middle of the 2000s, you were already seeing movements starting in Egypt protesting about and challenging the right of Gamal to succeed his father, and people saying, this is we're not a hereditary monarchy here. They thought of themselves as kind of a Republican form of government. And it was a shock to the system of many Egyptians that Mubarak would have the audacity to try to promote his son as his heir. And then I think kind of right before things erupted in Egypt, you had the parliamentary elections in November of 2010, which in order to prevent the Muslim Brotherhood from gaining any seats in those elections, the regime just very blatantly rigged so that the Brotherhood was completely shut out from any participation. I think they actually got 0 seats, whereas in 2005 they'd gotten 88. So that was kind of another blow to people's sense that maybe there was at least maybe a creeping fairness to the Egyptian political system. In addition to those factors, a couple of things I think helped to spread the protest. One was the growing impact of social media across the region and satellite TV as well. Al Jazeera played a very significant role in Tunisia and in Egypt in broadcasting events in a very positive light to Middle Easterners, to Arabs across the Middle East. And I think one thing that came out that I think many experts missed was that there was still a strong sense of pan-Arabism in the region that was ignited by the initial protests, and people began to feel once again part of an Arab world, a sense that maybe they hadn't had for quite some time. Many scholars, many experts thought that sense of pan-Arabism had died out after Nasser. But now you had a pan-Arabism that wasn't led from the top. It really was bubbling up from the bottom. But there were significant differences across the region. in as well, and how things played out. First of all, the countries whose leaders were removed or fell or fell into civil war were all secular autocracies. We mentioned Ben Ali, we've mentioned Mubarak. You had President Saleh in Yemen being forced to leave the country by the fall of 2011. Gaddafi in Libya, his forces were defeated and he was killed by October of that year. And in Syria, the President Assad's harsh response to protests had galvanized an armed insurgency by late 2011. Many people thought that he would be gone as well. I remember hearing from the chief of Mossad in 2011. He said, him telling several of us, Assad's days are numbered. We just don't know the number. Well, he and a lot of others of us turned out to be wrong about that, but that was kind of the perception at the time. The only monarchy that was really significantly in jeopardy was Bahrain, where you had a Shia majority that rose up to protest the lack of political rights and second-class status from the minority Sunni rulers. And so sectarian differences were a key factor. Bahrain was really primarily rescued by Saudi and UAE military intervention and Saudi financial aid. Other monarchies held on through offering very significant economic welfare and limited or sometimes promised political reforms in the case of Morocco and Jordan. The king of Morocco was very skillful, I think, in quickly moving to implement parliamentary elections and allowing a Islamic party that was previously in opposition to come to power when it won the majority in the parliament. In Jordan, the king said, we're going to move toward a constitutional monarchy. That hasn't happened, but that was the promise. And some cosmetic reforms were made to to the voting processes. And Saudi money helped Jordan kind of see its way through that first year. But interestingly, some countries in the region did not face significant Arab Spring challenges. Iraq, Lebanon, the Palestinians, and Algeria. Although Algeria did have a few protests. And I think in the case of those, you basically can see that they had several factors were at play. In the case of Iraq, you had the US invasion in 2003. You had free and fair elections after that in Iraq to bring a Shia majority to power. They didn't, I don't think that so there wasn't significant disaffection about political participation at that point in Iraq, and their economy was okay. Lebanon, you had the memories of the civil war from 1975 to 90 that were still very powerful. Lebanese were fearful of going back and having the country ripped apart again. The Palestinians had the second intifada only about 10 years before, which had destroyed their economy and resulted in about 4,000 Palestinians killed. And I think most of their anger was still directed against Israel, as opposed to their own leadership. And in Algeria, you had the powerful memory of the civil war in the 1990s, where upwards of 200,000 people had been killed. And that we think was a powerful motivator for Algerians. So recent history played a role, as did the ability in some cases to buy your way out of a threat or to skillfully manage it, as with Jordan and Morocco. Let me turn to the NIO, kind of my own experience, and to the sort of lessons learned for the intelligence community as a result of this process. It was obviously an extremely intense time for all of us in the intelligence community. There were daily policy meetings. I think I mentioned to you, Roz, earlier that I attended about 17 policy meetings in a row, early morning policy meetings after the Tunisian protests gave way to the Egyptian uprising. And really, I think the question that policymakers were grappling with was, and you saw a real division within the Obama administration over this. Do we support these uprisings, say the Egyptian one? Do we support the protesters? Do we support their call for Mubarak to step down? Or do we stand by our longstanding ally? And ultimately, President Obama made a pretty fateful decision to stand with the protesters and side with the more junior members of his policymaking community or in the NSC to in that regard, because the senior members were generally speaking saying, we can't abandon Mubarak. We need to stand back and let this thing play out, but we need to be seen. But this is, this is something that has to unfold internally in Egypt. If we side with the protesters, we could be unleashing a process whose end we do not know and whose consequences we do not know. But ultimately, he decided to go with the more, I guess, idealistic younger members of his policy community, and that was the debate, though, that kind of played out in regard to every uprising that was on offer during that period, whether it was Libya, Bahrain, Yemen, or elsewhere. One challenge for me was that while my staff and I were trying to track daily events and to write tactical analysis that would cover unfolding events, we were also trying to step back and take a strategic perspective on the implications of the uprisings. And I think we did a better job at the tactical than the strategic, at least for the first 3 months or so. There was just no time to really do much deep reflection. But looking longer term, because of the failure of frankly, the community did fail to anticipate the uprisings. I think we weren't alone. The academic community, I think, did not, by and large, anticipate the uprisings, even though we all recognized that there was much wrong with the situation in many of these Arab countries. There was also a sense that the security services and the militaries of these states would stay united with their leadership, and they would be able to prevail against any challenges. So, but the intelligence community kind of stepped back and took a longer look at what we needed to do differently. And one thing was, we realized that our tendency was to focus on rulers and elites, the military and security services, which had worked for us in the past. And where our collection was focused was no longer adequate. These events clearly demonstrated that. So one change was to focus much more on popular attitudes, particularly studying social media much more than we had. And we also tried to look at unconventional sources of information, such as NGOs and local actors who were not always on our radar previously. We realized also post-Arab Spring that the Middle East was more integrated than we had thought. That's the pan-Arabism I talked about. So we put more emphasis on regional and cross-regional analysis to get beyond the single country focus we had often pursued in the past. And we also increased our efforts to have functional and regional analysts combine efforts to integrate insights from things like demographic trends on the one hand, kind of being melded with or let's say the history of insurgencies and their successes and failures melded with traditional political and economic and military analysis. We've started doing a lot more of that. We also realized as time went on that it wasn't just the Middle East that was more integrated, the world was more interconnected than ever. And that so that events in South Asia, East Asia might affect the Middle East or what was going on in Eastern Europe. So we needed to look much more across regions than we had ever done before. And in the terms of what we call tradecraft, that is how you do your analysis, we really did some really intense kind of restructuring of how we did things, from much more questioning of assumptions. Why do we think these things are true that we've taken to be the case? And regular use of kind of, it became sort of a regular feature of almost all analysis that we had group brainstorming sessions to talk about how do you frame a piece, as opposed to simply having an analyst launch into it, and much more use of devil's advocacy, alternative scenarios, and that sort of thing. So those are some of that's kind of a sense of the Arab Spring and a sense of maybe lessons we learned.
Great. So let's try and we'll kind of skip a little bit. There was a lot of stuff that happened between 2011 and today, but maybe we could talk at this point about kind of where we are now And maybe you could sort of blend in a little bit, kind of what you think some of the impacts, kind of where the Arab Spring has kind of left the Middle East today. And talk a little bit about the United States and our interest there. So, there are a lot of experts have really begun to question, what are our vital interests in the Middle East? And we've had two administrations, really actually, well, two, Obama and the Trump administration kind of really say, we need to kind of extricate ourselves a bit, pivot to Asia. That's really, our interests are really elsewhere. But it's been hard to do, right? I mean, we've had a very difficult time extricating ourselves. And every time we try to do it, we seem to kind of get, pulled back in. So could you maybe talk a little bit about sort of where the Middle East is now, what you think US interests are in the region now?
Sure.
What's the right level of engagement? And what's the kind of the right character of US engagement in the region?
So first of all, let me give a sense of, at least broadly speaking, of what the impact of the Arab Spring and how it's unfolded on the region as a whole. In your original question to me, I think you had said, is some people would say the Arab Spring has failed. Is that a fair assessment? I think it is fair to say that it failed, but I think it's also fair to say it's not over yet. I think we're in the middle of maybe a generational process here, a 20 to 30 year process, perhaps. But certainly, I think that there is more Arab Spring to come. So thus far, the impact of the Arab uprisings has been pretty devastating on the region. You have had civil wars in Syria, Yemen, and Libya that have not ended, although Syria has wound down and Libya may be on a more positive trajectory. There's an attempt, there's a ceasefire, an attempt to form another transitional government, but much to be done. The civil wars have produced massive refugee flows from Syria, primarily, but also from Libya into the region and into Europe, and massive loss of life and suffering for the populations there. Humanitarian conditions in Syria are bad, and Yemen is considered the worst humanitarian crisis in the world, with probably upwards of 20 million people food insecure, and the UN is saying 15 million people could die of famine in the next 6 months or so if food aid isn't brought in. The economies of all three of these countries have been devastated, and they're going to require a generation to rebuild. Libya is a little better off because of the oil wealth, but they're not in great shape. In the region as a whole, between 2010 and 2019, if you leave out the oil exporting countries, poverty increased from roughly 1/5 to almost 1/3 of the population of the entire region. So that just gives you a very kind of broad sense of things are going in the wrong direction. Things are sliding back for many people at the middle and lower income level. The civil wars have also weakened central governments, leaving ungoverned spaces where terrorists continue to operate. And of course, the Syrian civil war gave rise to ISIS, which still has a presence in eastern Syria and a bigger one in Iraq. The Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula still has a foothold in Yemen. And ISIS and Al-Qaeda groups operate in Libya and neighboring states around Libya. Repression in the region has increased as countries have responded to unrest or fear of unrest by using their security services to monitor and jail dissidents at new levels, increased monitoring and manipulation of social media, and keeping the political space closed to any real popular participation. Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE have increased their repression. Jordan has increased its monitoring and control of elections, and Morocco has rolled back early reforms. Iran, which I haven't mentioned yet, has exploited the turmoil in Iraq, Syria, and Yemen to expand its presence and influence, heightening tensions with Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Israel, and leading King Abdullah of Jordan to worry about a Shia crescent spreading from Iran to Lebanon. And Iran, of course, has cracked down brutally on its own protesters over the last couple of years, with hundreds killed in I think the most recent crackdown they did at the end of 2019. So the uprisings have left the region fractured, ridden with conflict, with an unprecedented level of intervention by stronger states and weaker ones, and angry, restive publics. So I think we can expect to see some of the following trends continue to play out. Regimes, maybe the one that I think is most important, and I'll save a little bit of this for the end, kind of looking ahead, but one of the, I think, things that the trends that we are seeing and will see is regimes versus publics. The spirit of the Arab Spring, as I mentioned, isn't dead. Protests have been on the increase in some countries, Lebanon, Iraq, Algeria, since 2019. And I think those are just a sample of what people are feeling across the region. The Sunni states in Israel are seeking to counter Iranian influence through direct military action by Israel and support for proxies and financial aid to anti-Iran groups by Sunni states. So there's potential for rising conflict there. And then you're going to continue to have regimes versus subnational actors. In Syria, a fractured country, the regime only controls part of it. They're trying to deal with oppositionists, with terrorists, with Kurds who want, in the case of Kurds who want their independence. In Iraq, you've got still a terrorist problem, and the Sunnis in Iraq are very disaffected still. In Libya, you have militias that are still uncontrolled. That's been a key problem. And the terrorist presence has been reduced, but it still hasn't gone away, and we could see it resurge. And in Yemen, for example, the Houthis, a minority group who now kind of are the dominant power in the country, are posing a major problem for the government, the official government of Yemen, as are various tribes, and as I mentioned, Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. And Egypt, formerly a very kind of unified country, has still got a major problem dealing with ISIS terrorist groups in the Sinai. So what of U.S. interest in the region? Should we basically kind of throw up our hands and walk away? I think there's an inclination to do that among some analysts and policymakers. There's a sense of exhaustion. But I think just the starting point for me is I think we do need to recognize that our influence and credibility in the region has declined significantly in the last 15 years. This began really with our invasion of Iraq. We were advised not to do it by Sunni states, and it resulted in civil war in Iraq, the rise of AQI there, and an increase in Iranian influence in Iraq and the region. The Arab Spring also undercut our credibility with traditional allies. I mentioned the choices that the Obama administration was confronted with, but appearing to, rightly or wrongly, the appearance that we abandoned President Mubarak in Egypt was a major blow to our credibility with the Gulf states in particular, and certainly to many in the Egyptian leadership. The sense that from all the Sunni states that they wanted us badly to support the Syrian opposition against Assad, and they didn't feel that we really stepped up to do that. They felt it was much too weak an effort on our part. Our failure to enforce the red line in Syria on Assad's use of chemical weapons after we had said we would really caused them to question us. And then when Russia intervened in Syria without really any opposition from us, another blow. And finally, I think the nuclear deal with Iran, as beneficial as that might have been in many ways, it was seen as a betrayal by the Sunni Arab states, many of them, and by Israel. And I think we're kind of looking at the Obama administration, but under Trump, his failure to respond to the Iranian attacks in 2019 on the Saudi oil facility, Abqaiq, which I think took out of production 5% of global production for about 2 or 3 months, and doing nothing about the Iranian-backed attacks on Gulf shipping further kind of unnerved the Gulf states. And the way that Trump kept signaling that he was going to pull troops out of Syria and Iraq, and did so, it's certainly reducing, in a somewhat erratic way at points with Syria, and definitely reducing our forces in Iraq, added to the appearance for many states in the region that we're pulling up states and we couldn't be counted on. Although when you look at the objective fact, we still have about as many forces in the Gulf as we ever have. I think it's 40, 50,000 troops in the Gulf, and others spread across the region. So we haven't actually left, but we've given the appearance that we're not as committed. And certainly we don't have the clout we once did. I think the fact is that although many of our, is that many of our longstanding interests in the region, our vital interests, the free flow of oil, Israel's security, containing terrorism, Israel-Palestinian peace, have become less acute as concerns for us. We can, we don't need the oil as much. Israel can handle itself better than it's the strongest state in the region by far. The terrorist threat has been lessened. And right now, an Israel-Palestinian peace deal is just not in the cards. That is going to have to be rebuilt from the ground up. I'd say those issues haven't gone away, but they're much lessened. They're much less acute and intense than they used to be. And I think our overall approach as a result should be less ambitious than in the past in terms of our goals and our commitment of resources, emphasizing where possible diplomacy and economic leverage over force. I think, in my view, the Biden administration's general idea of pushing to resolve the Yemen conflict and trying to get ourselves back into the nuclear deal is the right type of approach, in that it's aimed at seeking to reduce tensions and take off the table a major source of potential conflict, the nuclear issue, at least push it down the road. Now, maybe some of their tactics can be questioned, but I do think the overall approach makes sense. I think we also need to urge and help the Arab states and Israel build on the Abraham Accords, but also urge the Palestinians to find ways to work with these states on the accords rather than rejecting them as they have. Because I think this could serve a couple of purposes. One is a united Arab-Israeli front could be a way of pressuring Iran to see that it'd be a way of deterring Iran, to see that they're facing a united kind of front in the region. But it also could be a way of bringing greater unity between the Palestinians and the Arab states that could, over time, lead to kind of a resumption of negotiations with Israel on a two-state solution. That's a long-term goal. I think, by and large, I believe that, in the past, we've tried to resolve problems ourselves, tried to remake countries internally. I think we need to focus much more on supporting partners to take the lead on terrorism, on conflict resolution, give them the training, give them the equipment, but they've got to deal with their own problems. And I think, as far as economic issues, that rather than we obviously don't have the resources to be financing these countries. Two things. One is work with the international community to try to build kind of a consensus on critical economic needs that need to be supported. Let's say a Jordan or a Morocco, targeted aid, Tunisia certainly, to help that country make a transition. And also that we need to press the oil exporters, even though their economic situation has worsened because of COVID and the economic downturn, to play a significant role in helping rebuild the region. So that's where I come out on that.
Let me pick up on one piece. And we'll get to some questions from the audience in just maybe 5 minutes. But on the regimes and on kind of the previous Biden approach, and I think you see little kind of overtones of it with the Biden's administration's approach to Saudi Arabia. So I guess what I want to ask you is, the Biden administration has really signaled much less forbearance for authoritarian regimes, just generally, than the Trump administration, including in the Middle East. And, Saudi Arabia has really come in for some pretty public rebukes. I mean, I think on the campaign trail, Biden called it a pariah state. I think he said something like the government has very little social redeeming value. And then we release an intelligence report, which blames the Crown Prince for Jamal Khashoggi's murder. I mean, it's a lot of, it's a pretty big shift, right, in tone towards Saudi Arabia. But yet it is a major partner. It's a longtime ally. What do you think about this kind of shift in the way, the tone? Is it just tone? Is it more significant than that? I mean, is that a risky strategy, do you think, towards Saudi Arabia? Maybe you could talk a little bit about what you see there.
Well, there's always been kind of these two strands, broadly speaking, in American foreign policy, kind of the idealistic and realist strands. But efforts to promote American values around the world have almost always been part of our foreign policy at some level or another. I do think that, and so I'm not surprised that the Biden administration is emphasizing that. I do think that, frankly, that Mohammed bin Salman needed to be called out more explicitly on the issue of his role in Khashoggi's killing. But we have to remember as we do that we're also seeking Saudi cooperation in trying to end the war in Yemen, and to Saudi cooperation in kind of developing an approach to a nuclear deal with Iran. We're probably going to be asking Saudi Arabia to finance various projects around the region where countries might be unstable if they don't get financial help. So, maybe significant humanitarian aid for Yemen. So at the same time that we're beating up on Saudi Arabia, we're already turning to them and saying we're gonna want you to be a key player on some of these important issues for us. So I think we need to be extremely careful about how far we push this. And of course, I think you and I had talked about this a little bit, Roz, that, we're certainly open to the charge of hypocrisy if we suggest that we can't talk to Mohammed bin Salman because of his role in the killing of Khashoggi, but we're really willing to sit down with the Iranians who have basically backed the killing of hundreds of American soldiers in Iraq. So I think we have to figure out a way to, state our values, state our desire for, and be frank in our criticism of countries if we don't like their behavior, but at the same time, not make that the only focus of our approach to them, and let it override kind of competing interests. So I think that however, I would close by saying that I think that what the Biden administration is doing does kind of signal that we are in a period of recalibration with Saudi Arabia, which kind of goes to the interest, the less intense interest in Gulf oil and other issues in the Middle East than we've had before. And therefore, I think less of a need, kind of broadly speaking, for a really tight relationship with Saudi Arabia. It may be becoming a more transactional type relationship now than it has ever been. We do need to be mindful also that the Saudis do have alternatives in terms of arms purchases from Russia or even China, and certainly shifting their investment focus to East Asia even more than they've done so already, as opposed to looking westward toward us and toward the Europeans. So I do think we have to be careful in that kind of balancing act.
So let's just talk a little bit about China and Russia, both of which have a kind of a growing presence in the region, slightly different lines of engagement. I think you could say. You could talk a little bit about kind of what their interests are in the region, and how much of a threat you think that they pose to U.S. interests.
I think the way I would put it is that I do think we need to be vigilant about their activities in the region, and kind of focused, being very careful to distinguish between things they do that are not a direct threat to us and things that undercut important U.S. interests. We have to keep in mind, as I mentioned earlier, that we're not the unrivaled hegemon in the region that we were, say, in the 1990s and maybe up to 2003, when we could basically do anything we wanted. We don't have that capacity now, and we don't have and therefore I don't think we should, it's in our interest to try to prevent Russia and China from engaging regional countries. I think where we need to think about is, where do we challenge them on specific issues and specific relationships? The Russians, I think, primarily are, when you get to the bottom of it, are a transactional power. They've focused on military relationships primarily and intelligence cooperation.
Mhm.
They focused on what they can get out of the countries they have engaged with. What can they get out of the Syrians? What can they get out of the Egyptians who they've been selling arms to? In the case of Egypt, it's helping the Russians, allowing the Russians to base forces in Western Egypt to go into Libya and train and equip Libyan forces who are associated with Field Marshal Haftar and the anti-Islamist coalition. In the case of Saudi Arabia, you could see the Russians working with them on oil production, quotas. But we saw the limits of that last year when they had quite a spat over cutting back, when the Saudis wanted to cut back on oil production, and the Russians said, we're not going to do that. That would hurt us. So they're definitely, and the Russians can't project power, I think, in the way we can. So there are definitely limits. I think where we have to worry is, for example, I think the Russian role in Libya has a potential to be to give them a base of influence there in terms of Libyan energy, Libyan economy, and putting pressure perhaps on Europe's southern flank in ways that would be detrimental to Europe and to us on energy issues in particular. So that's what we have to think through. As far as the Chinese go, so far they have remained, I think they've still wanted to be the free rider who develops economic ties, develops energy ties, develops their Belt and Road initiatives, and relies on the U.S. to be the security guarantor in the region. I don't see that fundamentally changing right now, but I do see the risk that China can use its economic clout to build ties with these countries, particularly some of the poorer countries in the region, that gives them leverage and influence that they could use to push these countries away from us or in ways that are counter to us. One example is this $400 billion infrastructure deal that they've signed. It's not finalized with Iran, which would give the Chinese significant influence in Iran's economy. And I think that could be used in ways that we would find prevented Iran from, gave Iran a buffer against pressure from us in unhelpful ways. I think the Iranians, being very nationalistic, are not going to want the Chinese to have that kind of influence, and that's going to be an obstacle. But again, Chinese economic clout, kind of Russian transactional capabilities don't necessarily pose a threat, but on specific issues, we need to be very vigilant that they don't challenge our interests.
Okay, so my last question for you, and then we'll jump into a couple of questions from the audience. Just looking ahead, and so NIOs, I should mention Alan and I work together, so we have, end up doing these strategic trends exercises occasionally. So what regional trends, long-term strategic risks, opportunities, are you going to be watching in the next 2 to 3, 5 years in the Middle East? And I think probably COVID is going to be maybe in that mix. So maybe you could talk a little bit about kind of how COVID has affected the region, maybe through kind of sort of the economic slowdown and some of the economic shocks, but maybe it's going to feed into some of these economic or sort of political discontent that you mentioned before, the failure of governments to deliver, or other things. So if you could maybe just give us a little sense of what you're worried about for the next couple of years, what you're going to watch, I think it'd be interesting.
I'll just pick 3 things. The first I mentioned earlier, regimes versus publics. I think what I'm getting at there is the Arab Spring is still alive. We see protest movements that have become true movements in Algeria, Lebanon, and Iraq, for example. We've seen since 2019, we've seen smaller protests continuing to bubble up in Egypt, Jordan, Morocco, and I think other places as well. And the fact is that all of the factors that I mentioned that contributed to the Arab Spring have basically worsened in the last decade. Mm-hmm. So I think the tinder is very dry, and a match could easily light it to bring massive protests in 1 or more countries in the region, and maybe the influence effect, causes it to spread. I certainly think some of the smaller the less well-off countries, non-oil countries like Jordan could be vulnerable. But I don't want to rule out, you know, I think Egypt is certainly vulnerable because of the massive repression that El-Sisi has engaged in, and the fact that the economy has not truly revived. And his popularity ratings have just plummeted over the last 4 or 5 years. Will the military get disrespected with him? Will the population rise up? Iraq is weak economically and politically fractured. That's a country that could kind of pull apart in very negative ways for us, allowing ISIS, for example, to rebound. So I'm concerned about instability, basically, and that could erupt again, Arab Spring type of instability over the next 2 to 3 years in Algeria, in Jordan, in Iraq, in Egypt, and maybe in places we don't really expect. We even see violent demonstrations in Tunisia in the last month or so over the poor economic situation in the interior of the country. So even Tunisia is vulnerable. Second issue is really the competition between Iran and the Sunni states in the region, which over the last several, since the Arab Spring has played out across the region in Iraq and Yemen and Lebanon. To some extent, it played out in Syria. That's become less of an issue in the last couple of years, as it's clear that really Assad has won. But those battles, primarily through proxy forces, are going to continue with, I think, destabilizing effect on the countries where they're taking place. I do think that the U.S. efforts to try to bring an end to the war in Yemen and to stabilize Iraq and to bring the Gulf Arabs on board with an approach to the nuclear deal are at least the right kind of steps to try to mute this conflict and prevent it from acting as kind of another brush fire in the region. Final thing I'll mention is Israel versus Iran and sort of the Iran allies like Hezbollah and so on. Israel has conducted over 200 strikes against Iranian targets in Syria over the last 3.5 years. They've hit Iranian targets in Iraq. They've probably conducted attacks in Iran itself. They will continue to do that as long as they believe Iran is seeking to maintain its presence in Syria and threaten them and build up Hezbollah. They will act against Iran if they believe that we will not over the nuclear program, if we can't stop it politically. So that has the potential to blow up as well, because Iran will strike back, but they might not strike back against Israel. They might strike back against the Gulf states, hit another oil facility, or us, who they see in league. They see us in league with Iran. So we're vulnerable. We're vulnerable if Israel has a successful strike against Iran, and the Iranians are looking for targets to make, to show that they can retaliate. So those are sort of 3 issues that I think have the potential to keep the region pretty roiled. I think what's happened with COVID and the economic downturn associated with COVID is basically, I think it's a little too early to tell what the political impact is going to be. The economic impact, economists are already saying, is severe. And you're looking at 5 to 7% drop in GDP for the region as a whole over 2020. Should rebound a little bit, but even the Gulf countries are having to scale back significantly, the Saudis and the Emiratis, to handle the impact of this crisis on their economies. And so that effect is going to be compounded for the Jordans and the Moroccos and the Tunisias and even the Egypts. So this is a region that was already in trouble, and COVID is making that much worse.
Okay, well, so we've talked a lot about a lot of big countries, a lot of the kind of hot spots. One place we have not really talked about is Turkey. So I thought maybe we could talk about that for a second. So Sinan Hastaran submitted a question. How do you see the role of Turkey in shaping the Middle East and the various conflicts in coming years? And do you expect it to be a constructive player?
First, let me truth in advertising. Turkey was not actually in my portfolio, so I followed Turkey as someone who had to because Turkey kept interfering in the Middle East while I was covering the Middle East. Where, I think that Turkey is, my perception of President Erdogan is that he really does envision himself as um, a uh, a leader of the Muslim world, and someone who wants to see Turkey as a powerful player in the broader region. We've seen Turkey, I think, over the last 3 to 4 years, begun to play a major role in Syria in dealing with the Kurds and trying to push back the Kurdish threat, in challenging the United States over our support for the Kurds, in brokering deals with Russia in Syria. Um, and I think we're going to see, but it looks like we're going to see kind of a long-term Turkish presence in Syria until they feel like their borders are secure, and they've, they particularly that they have reduced the threat of Kurdish autonomy in Syria. We have seen Turkey cooperating with Qatar to support Islamist organizations around the region. When Qatar was being isolated and sanctioned by the quartet, the Saudi, UAE, Bahrain, Egypt quartet, over Qatar's support for Islamist extremist organizations, Turkey backed them and said, "We'll stand with you." Turkey and Qatar have both cooperated closely in Libya to try to defend the kind of the pro-Islamist elements there. And I think we'll see, and Turkey really played a major role by introducing its military forces into Libya and pushing back Haftar's forces away from Tripoli and forcing a stalemate. And really that stalemate is what has led to the ceasefire and the political negotiations that have taken place. So Turkey's become a major power broker in the Mediterranean. They've also staked the claim on this. They got this agreement with Libya that Turkey could have access to this particular area of the Mediterranean where there are gas fields and so on, contrary to the claims of Cyprus and Greece and other countries. So there, I think, and Erdogan has been quite willing to challenge and criticize Israel for what he sees as its anti-Islamic practices. I think he sees himself as a defender of Muslims throughout the Middle East and the broader region. And I think that's the role he's going to continue to try to play.
Okay, so I have also a couple questions on Israel. So maybe I'll try to combine them. So one from David Tauger and another from Ben Waker. So one is, how do you think the Israeli-US relationship should develop? That could be should and will, if you want, should or will. And then to what extent, I think you mentioned this before, but I think people might be interested in hearing a little more about the nuance of what you were saying. To what extent will there be positive economic benefits to the Palestinians or political benefits too, as countries like Saudi and the UAE recognize Israel as a nation state? And how might those manifest? So I think you mentioned something about Saudi, UAE, and the Abraham Accords possibly entering into Israel-Palestinian negotiations. Can you maybe talk a little bit about that and also kind of how the U.S.-Israel relationship?
Yeah, on the Israel-U.S. relationship, I think that we're definitely that the relationship is definitely going to be more prickly in the next few years than it was under President Trump. Under President Trump, I mean, the Israelis basically got everything they wanted from him. Under Obama, it was much more standoffish relationship, and certainly Netanyahu and Obama themselves really had, I think, a certain animosity toward one another over particularly the failure from the Obama's part on Netanyahu's really, I think, refusal to sit down and seriously negotiate a peace deal. That's the way Obama perceived it. And on Netanyahu's part, the Iran nuclear deal, which Netanyahu thought was a very, very bad deal for Israel. because he thought it would allow Iran to go ahead and get nuclear weapons. I think that the Biden administration, in a sense, is picking up. I think they're going to try to have, at a kind of strategic level, good relationships with a good relationship with Israel, and they've articulated that. They've said that's what we want. We value Israel's as an ally, and we are committed to their security. But I think they're also likely to be very critical of any Israeli efforts to continue building settlements in the West Bank or any steps toward annexation. And I think they will be extremely critical of any Israeli efforts that seem to be aimed at undermining the US efforts to try to get back into negotiations with Iran. And I think when I say the relations are likely to be prickly, I am assuming for the moment that there is likely to be a right of center government in Israel after the elections. If somehow that does not happen, if you have a shift more toward the center or even the center left, which isn't impossible, that a coalition of that sort could be stitched together, especially if there's some electoral surprises in which parties gain seats. That you could have a significant change, because a Lapid-led government, for example, would I think be more amenable to serious talks with the Palestinians at some point, kind of resuming talks about a two-state solution. But I think there is just a couple of broad points here. One is, I think there is a general consensus in Israel that about the Iran nuclear issue. They don't all agree on exactly the right. They didn't all agree on the Iran nuclear deal. The Israeli security establishment was more willing to go along with it than the political leaders were. But they all agree on the level of threat that Iran poses to Israel, and they all agree that Iran must never get a threshold capability to have a weapon or a weapon, and that I think they would all agree on the need to act prior to that happening if the US weren't going to do it. So there is consensus around that, and I think there could be real tension there. And I think even a center government in Israel is not going to be supportive of the kind of Palestinian state that the Palestinians would seek, would demand or insist on right now. So there's a big gap there. So I do think we're in for a relationship that is still good, but a bit more troubled and with more prickliness to it, and differences over key issues than in the past. And some of it has to do, I think, with the fact that the Israelis don't need us as much as they used to. They're much stronger economically and militarily than they ever have been. And they're less dependent on us in many ways. So I think that's going to affect their willingness to challenge us in some ways. As far as the Palestinians getting positive benefits from the Abraham Accords, I think there are, the first thing that needs to happen is that the Palestinians themselves are going to have to figure out what their stance is going to be toward the Accords. They've rejected them thus far as an abandonment of the Palestinians and of their cause. And I think that's counterproductive. I think the Palestinians have got to step back and realize that that train has left the station and they're going to have to get on it in some way. And I think that means coming up with a different kind of set of positions, kind of goals that they have, or how to work with the Arab states to use the Accords to get concessions from Israel. That is, the idea being, Israel, if you want to further normalization with these Arab states, or let's say even Saudi Arabia, you are going to have to do things on your side that benefit, that kind of show your willingness to move on the Palestinian issue, or do things that don't undercut it, such as no more, holding off on annexation indefinitely, holding off, freezing settlement activity, things of that sort. As far as economics support for the Palestinians, the problem there is that the Saudis have been very good at promising over the years and not very good at delivering. I'm not sure they're going to get any better at that than they have been. I think part of the issue for the Palestinians is they need a new Salam Fayyad as prime minister to get their economic house in order, because right now people will, the Europeans will support them, will continue to give them money. The Arabs they'll get some money from the rich Arabs. But until people see that the Palestinians can run their affairs in a non-corrupt, efficient way, I think it's going to be a troubled relationship.
Okay, yeah. I have one question in the chat. If people have any other questions, I think we can probably go to the chat at this point, but let me ask one from the chat. This is from Abigail. How do you think the declining reliance on Middle Eastern oil, at least from the US, will affect Middle Eastern economies? With instability being a concern, how much will this work against the oil-reliant countries in creating other avenues of economic sectors that could potentially replace oil? So I think kind of diversification of their economies, and what does it mean on these declining oil prices?
So let's go over that one more time, Roz. So declining reliance on Middle East oil.
So let's just take this first part. I think that might be the easiest one. How do you think the declining reliance on Middle East oil will affect Middle East economies? And I think maybe the question is both the producers, but also those that don't have oil.
I'm not an expert on economics or on sort of all the ins and outs of economic diversification. We know, for example, what Mohammed bin Salman has been trying to do in Saudi Arabia, as he saw, in a sense, the writing on the wall in 2015, 16, that led to his Vision 2030 program. But I think and the recognition was, if we don't diversify our economy, if we don't develop a robust private sector that relies on other things besides carbon production, we're going to be in huge trouble. The result we've seen thus far is not very impressive. We've seen very little development of the private sector. We've seen we've seen significant social reforms in Saudi Arabia. Women can drive, and they've brought entertainment into the kingdom, and women are allowed to do many things that they weren't before, to take jobs in various industries, leadership positions, to mix with men in public in some arenas. But the real economic change that has been talked about hasn't really taken place in a significant way. The private sector, I think, is just as kind of weak or anemic as it was before. And the impact of COVID.
Oh, I think we might have lost Alan for a second.
I think has been.
Oh. I think we might have lost you for just a second, Alan, but you're back, okay, which is good.
Okay.
So his signal does not look great.
Basically, I
think your signal, yeah, I think your signal might not be great, Alan, but okay, we'll give it one more shot on the COVID. But if we lose you again,
okay,
we may just start to wrap here, and hopefully we'll get you back and see if we can grab you for a few informal questions.
Can you hear me now?
Yep.
Okay. So basically, I think that the declining reliance on Middle East oil is going to put tremendous pressure on these Gulf countries, these oil exporting countries, over the next decade, to really continue changing and diversifying their economies, or I think face very significant political instability. I think one result of them having less money is that you're going to have less money to invest in the region and to provide support to the less well-off countries, and that's going to be bad for all.
Okay, good. So I'm going to ask you one last question, and hopefully we'll get it squeezed in. And I liked this question. It came from Robert Piper, and he asked, "What do you believe is one thing that can realistically change in the Middle East to make it a safer place?"
I mean, I think looking at the near term, the immediate challenge over, say, the next 5 years is to try to bring a resolution to the civil wars that are taking place in Yemen, Syria, and Libya. The best place for us to start, I think, is where we've started in Yemen, where we have the greatest influence and leverage through the Saudis, and working closely with the UN. And I think I think that as far as Syria and Libya go, maybe Libya is second in terms of our ability to exercise some influence there. We're late to the game. We've let others kind of take the lead, but we do have one of our ambassadors who's played an important role in helping to, negotiate the terms of the new transitional government. So getting resolution to those conflicts, I think, is maybe the first step to making the region safer, because it'll strengthen governments over time, cut down on ungoverned spaces, cut down on refugee and internally displaced problems, and we'll have to go from there.
Okay. Well, thank you, Alan. If you don't mind, there might be a few people who might want to stay on and just say hello and ask you a side question. But I think at this point, we've gotten through a tremendous amount. So let me thank you for everybody, and let the folks go who are done dealing with the Middle East after 70 minutes. And hopefully we'll see you again at our next event. We will have another event in April, which will be on India, US-India strategic cooperation. All right, folks, thanks for joining us. Alan, I think, is going to stay on if you want to just ask him a question.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much, Alan.